Hello, aliens, mutants, and other interesting beings. My name is Cindy Koepp. I am a science fiction, fantasy, and gamelit author. What I'm going to do for you today is read to you the first scene in my new book, Urushalon 2, Into the Open. Amaya Alonia Kiand strode into the Kiat's waiting room and took a quick look around. The nautical decorations hadn't changed since her last visit a few weeks ago. The floor was sand and bivalve shells encased in a hard resin that reflected light coming in from the windows spanning the whole front of the building. The curtains over those windows were twisted strips of dark green material hanging from a rod draped with a fishnet. A pair of squashy turquoise armchairs at right angles to each other occupied the corner to her left. She frowned. There was such a thing as excessive decorating, and her superior's office had passed that mark a long time ago. At the seashell-studded desk across the room, the secretary, Tavia, wasn't it, sat. She wore a skin-tight seaweed green dress. Her hair, dyed to match, hung in braids of various diameters. Her makeup had turned her face an ocean blue with dark green vertical stripes. She made no effort to acknowledge Amaya's arrival, but continued affixing dark green fingernail extensions while humming a tune Amaya didn't recognize. Amaya crossed her arms over her chest. If one of her subordinates ever treated a guest in such a way, retraining and disciplinary action would be shortly arranged. Rudeness, however, was clearly an expected job skill in the Kiat's employ. Did Tavia's attitude extend to all the Kiandai, or just to her for having the audacity to want to help her human Urushalon protect his people? She rolled her shoulders to dispel the tension that was building. If she had to absorb some rudeness to keep Ed and the rest of the Las Palomas Police Department safe, she would do so for as long as it took. Her adopted human deserved at least that much. Movement drew her attention. Pavwin Vueltu Kiand of Falcon's Wing Station rose from one of the leather chairs and joined her. He clasped her right arm and pulled her into an embrace. So, he's pulled you in on this too, huh? He stepped back. She tipped her head to one side. Were they both here for the same reason? Assigning multiple stations to a task wasn't unheard of. With only 6 Kiandarai per station, sometimes more manpower was needed. But why include her in the station? She was still training up 4 Kiala. Although 2 would promote to full Kiandarai soon enough, 2 of them were barely out of basic training. Amaya followed him back to the chairs near the wall. Sitting in these, she might as well sit on the floor with her knees closer to her ears, but there were no other places to sit, and pacing would give the impression of impatience. She leaned closer to Pavwin and whispered, "Any idea what this is about?" He shook his head and made a quick nod toward the secretary, Tavia. Half a second after their rear ends made contact with the blue-green leather, the secretary stood. "The Kiat will see you both now." The smirk on her face precluded any suggestion of coincidental timing. Pavwin rolled his eyes as he stood and adjusted the equipment pouch on his belt, which only added a hint of a sneer to the secretary's lips. Keeping her own annoyance out of her face, Amaya used the arms of the chair to push herself up. She followed Tavia and Pavwin down the hall behind the secretary's desk. Muted green and blue lighting had been added since her last visit. The flowing blobs of color reminded her of a disorientation training back when she was still a Kiala. Given the number of people who were nauseated by these visual effects, Emiron's choice of lighting puzzled her, but then he didn't seem the obliging, welcoming sort. The secretary waved her hand past a sensor plate near the door decorated with porpoises, then strutted back to her desk as the door slid open. Pavwin gestured Amaya in ahead of him. The waiting room's decorator had been given a free hand in here, too. Dense, sand-colored carpet was deeper in some areas than others, giving the floor a rippled appearance. Artwork on the walls showed off reefs and their flurry of brilliantly colored wildlife. Emiron Coral Kiat sat at his mahogany desk, typing furiously on his keyboard. As hard as he hit the keys, Amaya marveled that the keyboard was still intact. How often did he have to replace it? Older than both her and Pavwin by at least 2 decades, their superior had close-trimmed gray hair a few shades lighter than their uniform. Permanent wrinkles marring his face suggested that he'd neither smiled in ages nor spent any time in the sun. His copper collar tabs sported a new orange crystal for successfully completing the demolitions course. A curious choice for someone who didn't do fieldwork anymore, but the protocol allowed Keandrai to choose studies that interested them, even if they weren't very practical. Eyes still glued to the boxy computer, Myron pointed to the blue leather chairs with seashell-studded wooden legs. Sit. Amaya settled into one of the padded chairs while Pavlin took the other. What was next? A treat or a pat on the head to celebrate their obedience? Myron scowled and jabbed the screen's off switch. He turned a hard stare on them. You'll both need to prepare to receive Rinulin Talutura. Amaya shifted in her seat, but schooled the amazement from her features. What could possibly interest someone of his station in one of the smallest enclaves in Texas? Warren Aldaway had no major features or facilities that might cater to the ultra-wealthy. The aquarium was tiny relative to others in the state. No unique cuisine called this enclave home. Sure, the beach might interest some, but there were larger enclaves with more to offer that also had an impressive beach. Worse, she'd never been close enough to see a member of nobility in person. How did one act in the presence of an Eshivani baron? The most basic protocols for such an event eluded her, and now she had to prepare to receive him as a guest of the enclave? The family of her Kiala, Vaden, traveled in that social group, or at least closer than she'd ever been. Still in the middle phase of his training, would he be up to the task of training the rest of them? If not, could she borrow a social hierarchy specialist of another station for a crash course? Pavlin raised an eyebrow. Nobility? Here in the buffer zone? Yes. Myron leaned back in his chair. He's meeting with the governors of the human states that overlap our territory. Amaya looked up at the corner of the room and recalled an overlay map of human and Eshivani territory. So that'd be Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. Pavlin squinted for a moment and nodded. Yes, we overlap parts of each. With the Tura coming from the Texas Panhandle and the governors coming from Oklahoma City, Austin, and Santa Fe, somewhere in central or western Texas would make more sense. Was there any way to talk them out of this? Ill-equipped and undertrained, any other station would be a better choice. Well, that's good to know, but Warren Aldaway and Las Palomas are small as cities go. Amaya steepled her fingers. Wouldn't a larger city have more of the facilities they'll likely need? Myron waved a hand in dismissal. It's enough for you to know to be ready for his arrival. Now, if he thought he could brush her off that easily. Amaya squinted and frowned. If you want me to protect him with limited resources and half-trained personnel, I need more info than that. Myron's ears turned pink. He drew a breath, but before he spoke, Pavlin leaned forward and cut him off. It would be helpful to know why they chose to meet here of all places. Neither the Enclave nor the city has much to offer such august persons. Amaya glanced at Pavlin and nodded. Aside from some tourist trap establishments, Las Palomas was as sparse as the Enclave on the matter of fascinating things to do. Myron twisted to face Pavlin directly. The wives of 4 of the delegates will be here, and 2 of them are bringing their children. There's talk of visiting the beach, our aquarium, and the Humans Museum. Well, this got better with every passing second. 3 governors, the Tura, their wives, and children. They're bringing families. Amaya's left hand drifted down to her right shirt cuff, but the bracelet was gone. After coming to terms with her grief, she'd given the bracelet to Ed to re-gift or dispose of. The bare twinge of sadness was still there, even if the jewelry was not. She rubbed her wrist for a moment, then steepled her fingers again. Kiat, we should advise a different coastal town. I've only been training Las Palomas police for almost a month, and they're not equipped. Nor have we gotten the local crime wave under control. We'll have a hard enough time securing the Tura and 3 governors, never mind wives and children. Myron wagged his finger at her as if she were some petulant child. Your only concerns are the Tura, his wife, and his children. Let the humans take care of themselves. How terribly mercenary. Would the Tura agree with that? Well, then I'll coordinate with Las Palomas Police, make sure all is in hand. A visit to Ed would be imperative. His captain might have been freer with information. Myron slammed his palm on the desk. You will not leave the security of the Tura in the hands of the humans. He could pound furniture all he wanted. If she had to prepare, then she would take full advantage of all available resources, including Las Palomas Police Department. But if we don't communicate with the humans, we'll trip over each other in our efforts. Pavlin shook his head and tapped his fingers on the seashell studding the arms of the chair. We might even take contradictory actions or interfere with each other's plans. I suppose. Myron glared at Amaya. You keep your priorities in order. She had every intention of maintaining priorities, but he shouldn't be terribly surprised if hers failed to align with his. When should we expect the delegations to arrive? 15 days. Pavlin tugged a small notebook out of his shirt pocket and jotted the date on a blank page. And what will the Chura need from us? He will contact you when the time comes. Pavlin, you have control of the situation at the aquarium and the beach. Alanya, you have all the buffer zone and Las Palomas activities. Serve with diligence. Myron turned away from them and jabbed the power button on his monitor again. Referring to her by only her surname was a petty insult worthy of grade school children, which was roughly what she guessed his level of emotional maturity to be. Amaya concealed an eye roll by standing up and turning away from Myron. She indicated the door with a nod and led Pavlin out. Once the door closed behind them, she turned to him. Well, she stopped. In all likelihood, Tavaya was fully the servant of her master, which meant that anything spoken in her hearing would be taken out of context, twisted around, and used in the most damaging way. Was highly informational, she finished. Anyone with a few milligrams of character would have left such a politics-crazed environment long ago. She had danced through these interpersonal quagmires before. Yes, very. Pavlin leaned closer and whispered, outside. Amaya nodded. They entered the waiting room. Tavaya's smile was as real as her dark green hair color. She glanced up from rearranging strips of green cloth on her dress. Serve with diligence. Amaya nodded once. Serve with diligence. Once the outer door slid closed behind them, Pavlin guided her to the side of the building out of the sight of the windows. The parking lot, paved with reclaimed plastics, was large enough for a few cargo haulers or a half-dozen couriers. A larger lot behind the building would accommodate larger vehicles. Spindly oaks and yopons formed an intermittent ring around three sides of the parking lot. From where they stood, the ugly blue-gray box of the local training center was clearly visible. The sun beating down on them would cook them in moments. Amaya led Pavlin to the shade of a cluster of nearby oaks. Pavlin leaned against one of the trunks. I have to say I'm impressed by how little you react to Myron's insults. Amaya shrugged. That's part of my specialization. I pretend I'm dealing with humans. They're that rude. He tipped his head to one side. No, not really, but in some environments they don't find offense in addressing someone by surname only, and many take pride in staying calm under fire. I see. When dealing with that one, he nodded toward Myron's office, that must be useful. And on the matter of human reactions, if you can find a block of time, my staff and I will need instructions on how to handle them before those human governors arrive. I don't even know how to greet them properly. They seem so aloof. Amaya smiled at the common misconceptions. Humans, by contrast, often found her people too emotional. They do come across that way. Humans have stricter expectations of permitted physical contact, some cultures more than others, especially between men and women. I'll look at my schedule and send you some options. We'll find a time and place. His comm system beeped. He clasped her right arm and pulled her into an embrace before he stepped away and tapped the dark blue comm crystal on his silver collar tabs. After a short and tense conversation, he jogged across the parking lot toward his Avi. To stay out of the way, she watched him go before hustling to her own avocopter. She stepped up into the pilot seat and set her trauma kit behind her. For a welcome change, the avocopter started up on the first time she triggered the ignition. The wings extended with a creak before she lifted off and turned toward Ed's house. No better time to start coordinating than now. Once clear of the trees, she rolled the accelerator forward. Officer Mark Hollis pulled into the parking lot of a gas station and rolled down the window. The caller was supposed to meet them here and fill them in on possible trespassing problems. Calls to this end of town were a mixed bag. He'd handled everything from some goofy kid trying to snitch a candy bar to a double homicide. The sporadic scattering of derelict buildings meant this was prime real estate for all manner of shenanigans. His partner, Officer Robert Kirby, leaned across and pointed. There. Hollis twisted toward the station. A grease monkey came out of an open door, wiping his hands on a badly stained and faded red towel. Hollis tried to get a read on what sort of call this was going to be. Smudges of dirt and old oil marred the man's face and coveralls. Graying hair peeked out of the edge of a Houston Astros baseball cap. The grease monkey, favoring his right leg some, moseyed toward the car and smirked. He leaned over and rested his elbows on the car's door, then recoiled and winced. If he didn't know it already, the old-timer would soon find out that the summer of 1965 was going to set heatwave records. Even the white part of the black and white could be used for a griddle, and it wasn't even July yet. "Y'all sure got here quick." The mechanic rubbed his arm before resting both hands on his knees. That was a new one. So often people complained that the response time was too long. Hollis nodded. "We were in the area." "So, what did you see across the street?" "Tall fella. Could have played for the 76ers, you know the type. Didn't get a good look at him, but he just might have been one of them Eshuvani. I've been watching that place since I saw him sneak around back, and he ain't come back out." He indicated the building across the street with a nod. "How long ago?" Kirby stretched one arm across the back of the seat and leaned forward. "Just 'fore I called." He shrugged. "So what, 10 minutes maybe?" The old man scratched under the edge of his ball cap. "What do you figure someone would want with a closed-up fireman dime anyway? Ain't nothing left in there except maybe a couple old shelving units and enough dust to grow taters." Hollis frowned. They did not need any more Eshuvani criminals in Las Palomas. The last one had killed some officers and wounded several others. Although not a total surprise, Hollis's guts turned just thinking about the prospect. No telling. Hollis checked the boarded-up tan brick structure in his rear-view mirror. No obvious activity now. "You stay put over here while we check it out." "I'll keep my eye on the place, but I don't want nothing to do with no twig." Eshuvani were tall and thin like twigs, but they were nothing to make sport of. Hollis hadn't met one yet who couldn't take a human apart like rotten wood. Fortunately, they weren't all bad news. Like most groups, a few problematic ones gave all of them a bad name. He nodded. "Fair enough." With any luck, the grease monkey's attitude would keep him from trying to help. The old man backed away. Hollis shifted the car into reverse and headed across to the now defunct Five and Dime. "So they're breaking into abandoned buildings now?" Kirby turned around for a look at the storefront. Hollis glanced at Kirby as he parked. Maybe he needed a place to hide. "And his real target is..." Kirby twisted around and aimed his thumb at the gas station across the street. "Maybe." Hollis left the keys in the ignition and tugged on the door handle. "I'll keep an eye on the back door. You watch the front. We'll wait for the Keon drive before we go in." Kirby blew out a breath. "Right." For the briefest moment, Hollis reconsidered the plan. If the suspect really was Eshuvani, splitting up might get one of them hurt. Their recent training wasn't that far along yet. With only two of them, though, they'd only cover one exit if they stayed together. Most criminals were smart enough to figure out how to use one exit when the other was being watched. Without additional backup, this was the only way. Hollis slid out of the car and jogged around to the back of the building, staying well away from the cinder block wall. The wooden door was splintered and broken inward, probably the result of a couple well-placed kicks. He found a reasonable hiding place behind some chest-high Johnson grass growing up through the uneven cracks in the pavement and watched the back door. The rhythmic hum of an avocopter grew louder. A clang came from inside the building. Moments later, an Eshuvani male with pale eyes and sparse dark hair slipped out of the broken door. He carried a length of pipe and slid a palm-sized angled object into his pocket. A tremor built up in Hollis's hands. He'd seen the results of a human officer taking on an Eshuvani criminal alone. That never went well for the human. His mind flashed back to his own one-on-one encounter years ago. He'd never wanted to look down the barrel of his own gun again. Several years had passed, and he was older, wiser, and better trained now. He drew his gun and aimed at the suspect. "Freeze! Face down on the ground, now!" The Eshuvani took one look and bolted across the back of the building. Hollis took off after him. The suspect dodged around stacked milk crates and delivery trucks behind the grocery store, next to the defunct Five and Dime. Hollis had started only a couple strides behind, but steadily lost ground, at first. Taking full advantage of his greater human endurance, he closed the gap as the suspect's stamina dwindled. As Hollis came around the corner of a large dumpster, a strike on his right wrist sent the gun flying. A gray blur in the corner of his eye moved toward his head. He ducked, and the length of pipe whooshed past. Hollis kicked the Eshivani's knee, making him stagger backwards. The suspect spun and stumbled the last yard or two to a small blue and yellow avocopter parked behind the dumpster. Hollis pushed off from the ground and came back up to his feet, but the suspect was already seated in the pilot's chair and extending the wings. As the blue and yellow avocopter lifted off, Hawksnest's gray and silver courier cast a shadow on the pavement. If only they'd been here just a few minutes sooner, they might have had the suspect. He leaned against the warm metal of the shady side of the dumpster to catch his breath. Blaming the Keandrai was no good. Unless they'd been on a call somewhere in the city, they would have been coming from a few miles beyond the far side of town. The way their dilapidated equipment malfunctioned, they'd caught a lucky break to have an Abbey actually working right, for a change. Hollis rubbed his wrist. A sharp report of the initial hit had faded down to a heavy ache. Although he didn't think anything broke, he would have to get it checked out and fill out an injury report. Joy. More paperwork. He shielded his eyes with his hand and looked up. The courier ship chased after the blue and gold. When they were out of sight, he looked around for his gun and found it next to a clump of grass. He retrieved it and holstered it. "Hollis!" Kirby hollered. He drew a deep breath and shouted back, "Here, I'm okay!" He threaded his way back toward his partner. Kirby jogged around a delivery truck and slowed when they made eye contact. He returned his pistol to its holster, and the creases in his forehead smoothed out. What happened? Hollis met his partner halfway. An Eshivani came out of the building with a hunk of pipe and took off running. Hollis grabbed his aching wrist and moved it back and forth through the range of motion. A twin shrieked at him when he bent his wrist back. That was going to smart when the adrenaline wore off. I got whacked on the arm as I came around the corner, but I ducked the follow-up. All that training with Hawksnest is paying off. Kirby absently rubbed his sternum. I'll say. He recalled about a month ago when a suspect had nearly killed Kirby with a shellfish knife. If Osborne hadn't shown up with his Eshivani Urushalon right about then. Kirby sighed and shook his head. You know, it'd be real handy if we had a way to stay in contact when we have to split up. Yeah, I know. Osborne and Amaya are working on getting us collar tabs like the Keandrai. He nodded toward the building. Let's see what we can figure out from the building. Sure you don't need a hospital? Kirby glanced down at Hollis's wrist. Hollis winced at the sharp sting as he slowly flexed it. Yeah, an ER visit was going to be in order, but later. Otherwise, Kirby would have to deal with the damage in the defunct store alone. Not a safe proposition by any means. The pipe wielder might return with or without friends. Let's get this dealt with first. He headed back to the broken door. That was the first chapter of Urushalon 2, Into the Open, which releases on April the 30th. You can catch up with the rest of my works on my webpage at ckoepp.com. Thanks a lot.